both for that wonderful introduction. It's always embarrassing when people talk about you, but thank you. I'm thrilled to be with all of you here this morning. I'm really excited by the many people in this room and to be reacquainted with some old friends that I haven't seen in a very long time. So it's terrific to be here. And thank you again to the board of the Economic Progress Institute for inviting me here. It's really great to be back here in Rhode Island, which has really been it's been a long time home for us at Jobs of Justice, both with our local Rhode Island Jobs of Justice, and I want to recognize Mike here as our local director who's done tremendous work. And this has actually been our home to our national conference back in 2008. And so this picture, some of you may have been there in the pouring rain as we were marching to the Capitol and talking about state budget cuts at that time, back in 2008. Anyhow, it is really great to be back here in Rhode Island. This morning, I hope to share with you a bit about the lives of some of the men and women who have given me real hope and that progress and victory are possible for working people. But before I go to that, I do want to take a brief step back and share a little bit more about Jobs of Justice. So at Jobs of Justice, we believe that all working people should have employment security, a voice on the job, and a decent standard of living in an economy that works for everyone. With our 36 coalitions in 22 states, we're building a movement of labor, community, faith, and student organizations to win real victories that improve the lives of people, not just here in the United States, but around the world. Right now, as you all know, it's an incredible, dynamic, and challenging time for working people in our country. There are tremendous obstacles that are keeping working people from getting ahead. But there's also tremendous momentum behind an economic agenda that stands to benefit the millions of Americans who feel like they're working longer, harder, and for less. There are pathways or roads to an economy where working people don't just make a good living, but they have a good life. And we'll talk about those in a bit. But first, it's important to think about how we got into this economic rut. So often we think and we talk about the economy as if it's like the weather. We have no control over it. Or how it can cause chaos or damage to all of us. But that's not true. Let's be clear. Our economy is out of balance because people have rigged the game against working people. It's harder to put food on the table, buy diapers, or make it to parent-teacher conferences because for the past 35 years, deliberate choices have been made that have made it harder for everyday folks. You're not just imagining that your paycheck, making your paycheck stretch further and further, that you keep having to figure out how to make it stretch. It's not just you or not just your family. Wages are flat, even though the stock market is doing better. Sorry, did I hit something wrong here? Here we go. Hold on. Okay. Wages are flat, even though the stock market is doing better. Job numbers are up, but as the congressman talked about earlier, so is CEO pay by 1,000% since 1978. Too many working people today are facing hard choices between paying for food, paying for housing, paying for childcare, or paying for medicine. The people who serve food on our tables at restaurants and cafes cannot put food on their own tables. That is shameful. Or the fact that the people who care for our loved ones, our children, our aging adults in our lives, cannot afford care for themselves or their own families. It wasn't always this bad. It used to be that the way we did business worked for all of us. Why? Because we used to invest in things like education and infrastructure. And it worked. And in the time following the Great Depression to 1980, 70% of all income growth in our country went to 90% of the population. Think about that. Nearly everybody benefited. Growth was shared. So what changed? In the 80s, taxes were cut for those at the top of the ladder. We invested less in things like schools and roads. And remember that 90% of people who saw their wages grow? Between the 80s and now, that same group of people saw no growth in their income. Nothing. So where did that money go? 100%, all of it, went to the top 1% earners. The game is rigged, plain and simple. And there are people who are pulling the strings. But you know what? After 35 years of this nonsense, working people are just fed up. This fight to reclaim our economic power is hard. And you know that? You all know that in this room. And yes, we're facing staggering odds. We're up against people with tons of money and tons of power. If you're here in this room this morning, you know firsthand that it can be hard to have hope in the work that we do sometimes. It's hard to believe that change is possible. But we have all met people through our work that inspire us. You all have stories, as do I, that get you out of bed in the morning. So this morning I want to share some stories with you. They're the people whose stories push me to keep fighting. They're real people, the soul of this movement. And they've shown us how we win this fight and what a real road forward looks like. So let's start close to home. Around the world today, there are over 216 million people who have to live outside of their countries, often away from their families, in order to find jobs that can support their families. I don't think people understand that sheer number. When I did a presentation like this a few weeks back, and I asked in the room, how many migrants do you think there are around the world? And people are like, I don't know, maybe 2 million, 3 million? No, it's over 216 million people in this world, and that number is growing rapidly. We have employers who can pay immigrants very low wages and get away with it. Many immigrant workers come to this country and face serious exploitation. But the exploitation they face here is better than the conditions in their home countries. Vicente and Pedro live here, right here in Providence. They work in the kitchen at Teriyaki House, just a few blocks away. Vicente and Pedro and their co-workers often work more than 72 hours a week. They get one break every day for just 15 minutes so they can eat. When payday rolled around for Vicente, Pedro, and the other Teriyaki House staff, forget overtime. These guys weren't even paid the minimum wage. Imagine that. Working more than 70 hours a week, one tiny break, and making less than minimum wage for years. You see, Teriyaki House managers were taking advantage of their employees, including Pedro and Vicente, because they're immigrants. And this kind of treatment is unfortunately all too common, from skirting minimum wage and overtime pay laws to threatening employees with immigration enforcement. Vicente and Pedro's stories are what millions of immigrants face on a daily basis all across the country. But Pedro and Vicente and the rest of the Teriyaki House employees weren't about to take this line down. Thanks to the great organizing of Fuerza Laboral and Jobs to Justice here in Rhode Island, they filed a complaint with the Department of Labor over the massive minimum wage and overtime violations. They visited Congress to make the case for the POWER Act, which would prevent employers from retaliating and exploiting them due to their immigration status. They protested outside the restaurant, and they won. Woo! In January, following a direct action outside Teriyaki House, Pedro and Vicente walked out of the restaurant with checks from their manager, as you can see in the picture, with the money they were owed after years and years of fighting. Look, many of us have a personal family story of migration. as well as stories of how our families have worked and moved to go to school, to find a job, to reunite with our loved ones, or to find dignity and a better future. We need fair and humane immigration policy in the United States that centers the needs of working families versus the needs of corporations. Right now, if we stop allowing low-road employers to deny their employees their rights, not only will employers who play by the rules benefit, but so will all working people whose employment standards are being dragged down by the status quo. So this now brings me to Terrence. Terrence is a father to 3 little girls and lives, I just said something. Hold on. Okay. This brings me to Terrence. Terrence is a father to 3 little girls and lives in Kansas City. He usually leaves before they wake up in the morning and makes it home after they're asleep. He's worked for Burger King for the past 10 years and makes just $9.30 an hour. He is a second-generation fast food worker. His mom was a fast food worker for years, and this was the only job that he could access in his community. So he's he identifies as a second-generation fast food worker. Terrence's fiance is a home care provider. She works full-time, but for low wages, about $9 per hour as well. They work hard, they try to meet the needs of their family, but they have definitely experienced bouts of homelessness. When 2 parents working full-time aren't making enough to sustain their family, something is very wrong. Fast food employers like Burger King are leading the race to the bottom that's crushing communities and workers in every corner of our economy. This business model is one of low wages, tax avoidance, and no accountability. It's now what we find actually in many, many industries, like home care, child care, airports, universities, and much more. Working dads like Terrence aren't paid enough to afford childcare, and we don't have the public resources we need to find quality childcare programs. And all the while, families like Terrence's are being forced to scrape by because big corporations are ripping off their employees and the communities they're in. But Terrence knows that people like him who work for a living ought to earn a living. And that being able to provide for his 3 girls is what matters most. So Terrence got involved with the Fight for 15 and a union. And he's leading that fight both in his Burger King store, in his community in Kansas City, and nationally as well as globally. This fall, he spoke at the White House Summit on Worker Voice about what it's like to make minimum wage. He introduced President Obama. And I was there, and President Obama, he got up on stage and everyone clapped, and he said, "Are you clapping for me or are you clapping for President Obama?" He was very sort of charismatic. But then he does a little bit of a story, and mostly he's there to introduce the president. The president comes to the stage and he says, "Let me tell you about Terrence," and tells Terrence's story. And one of the most heartwarming moments was he pointed out Terrence's mother and had her stand up. And he said, "This is the first time in 10 years this mother and this son have been reunited because they could never afford a plane ticket to visit each other." His mom lives in Florida and he's in Kansas City. The fact that the president was so moved by that and felt the need to share that says a lot about so much that's wrong right now when we think about the experiences of minimum wage earners in our country. Terrence insists, that's the picture, Terrence insists that $15 is not an impossible dream. The way to achieve it is to get all types of low-wage workers involved, is what he says. We have to build a movement for all low-wage workers. And we know that dream isn't possible, it isn't impossible too. We know it's completely possible. Look at New York, look at California, home care providers in Massachusetts, cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, And that all happened because working people like Terrence, took to the streets and demanded a fair return on their work. That didn't just happen because some people woke up one day and said, let's just raise the minimum wage. But it really was because workers took risks and fought hard. And here's the thing. Terrence isn't just fighting for $15. He's fighting for $15 and a union. It's not just about wages. It's about having a voice on the job too. It's about having a voice and the opportunity to shape your workplace, your communities, and your future. We have to make sure that anyone who wants to come together and negotiate what goes on at the jobs they do have that right recognized. Terrence is also a key leader in the movement for Black Lives in Missouri. Post-Ferguson, when Ferguson happened, actually when the shooting and killing happened in Ferguson, he and other fast food workers in Ferguson came together and began organizing as part of the movement for Black Lives, fighting for real structural change in their communities and access to better jobs, access to services that are needed, but also to reform the criminal justice system. And that gives me hope that there's a lot of intersections of these issues today. Because guess what, for working people, they don't just identify 1 minute as a worker, and the next minute as a Black person, and the next minute as an immigrant, and the next minute as a woman. They actually encompass all these identities, which means that we have to be more comprehensive when we think through the kinds of policy solutions and organizing that we do today. Jobs like Terrence's are among the fastest growing in the country. The other sector seeing incredible growth is retail, and that brings me to Kimberly. In the weeks between Black Friday and Christmas, one of the busiest times of the year for women like Kim who work in retail, she worked an average of 47 hours a week. If she wanted, Kim's supervisors would have given her 60 hours. The very next week, her schedule was slashed to just 28 hours. Kim is regularly cut from shifts early when business is slow, and often pays to go get to work only to find out that the store doesn't need her. Kim cannot look for a second job because she is on call, which means she has to be available to work whenever needed, but is not paid for this time. That means Kim is forced to pick up extra shifts to make up for the instability of her paycheck from week to week. Can you imagine? How do you budget your life if you have no idea how many hours of work you're going to get from week to week? Kim is a working woman in one of America's fastest growing industries, and there are 7.2 million women like Kim who are disproportionately women of color and face not just low pay, but erratic schedules, on-call shifts, insufficient work hours, and few, if any, of the most basic benefits like paid sick days or any kind of retirement security. Kim's a mom. She's missed doctor's appointments and parent-teacher conferences because of her schedule. But being able to be there and to provide for her daughter isn't negotiable. And as the retail industry continues to grow in the coming years, will companies like Macy's, where Kim works, require moms like Kim to do more with less? Something is wrong when there are millions of men and women like Kim who work hard and still can't make ends meet. But Kim has ideas about how her job could be improved. She knows her job inside out, so who better to come up with new, innovative solutions to age-old problems? Kim is using her voice to eliminate all of the obstacles that keep her and other women who work in DC's retail sector from being able to negotiate what's best for them at work. With our local coalition in DC, Kim and other retail employees are coming together to make stable schedules the norm for women and men who work in the district's retail sector. They have designed a campaign demanding just hours and predictable schedules. We think it is absolutely critical to lift up the issues of ours in a time when cities and states are raising wages and hearing the call for $15 in a union. You can't raise wages and then cut hours and expect anyone to be able to climb out of poverty. Jobs and Justice passed similar legislation in San Francisco about a year and a half ago. It was called the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights. It was the first bill of its kind and ended on-call schedules, demanded that schedules become more predictable, and changed the conversation about what's possible for working women and men, not just in the Bay Area, but across the country. That victory has changed the lives of over 40,000 working people in San Francisco. And I know people right here in Rhode Island are trying to make fair and predictable scheduling a reality for working men and women here too. Here's the reality. Work is changing. Close to a third of our population is working what's called contingent work. Part-time, temporary, and subcontracted work. That means that lots of the benefits that working people have been able to gain through the traditional and historic relationship between employers and employees no longer hold true. So we have to address the changing nature of work. What does it mean to have such large numbers of part-time work in our communities, in our cities, in our states? Moving campaigns like the San Francisco campaign gives us the ability to create the on-ramps working people need to organize, negotiate with their employers, and build the power our movement needs to win bigger and bolder demands. We're confronting corporate power in new and creative ways to expose who is the real boss. Because that third of workers I said who are contingent, most of them have no idea who their real boss is. And we saw this in the campaign around McDonald's, where McDonald's franchises were saying, well, it's really the headquarters who decides, and the headquarters are saying, it's really the franchisees who decide, and it's a shell game for workers. So we have to design campaigns that allow us to name who is really the decision makers and how do we win what we need from them. So now I want to turn to a story that I know really well, which is my own. Since 2011, Caring Across Generations has been building a national movement to transform how we live, age, and care in America. We bring together aging Americans, people with disabilities, in-home care workers, and their families to increase every family's access to the care and support they need at a price they can afford, while creating millions of high-quality in-home care jobs. Baby boomers are starting to retire, and their need for care is growing. And millennials are starting to become parents, so their need for care is exploding. So on both ends of the spectrum, care, there's huge, tremendous needs around care. Every 8 seconds, an American turns 65 in this country. That's 10,000 people a day, 4 million a year. By the year 2050, the number of us who will require some form of long-term care will double to 27 million. Currently, there are 2 million home care workers in the United States. By 2020, that number is expected to double. Yet the wages are so unfathomably low, with average wages just a little over $9 per hour, so low that the women, mostly women of color and immigrant women, we count on to care for our loved ones, can't afford to care for their own families. Care providers are more susceptible to wage theft, intimidation, and retaliation from their employers, and many who are here without some of the most basic protections like overtime and minimum wage laws. And that was changed last year through a regulatory change that we moved at the national level. But I think most people know that domestic workers, home care workers were excluded from basic federal labor laws, right? This critical workforce, which so many already depend on, and which must be the cornerstone of any caregiving policy in the future, is so devalued and underpaid that many are forced to leave the profession if they want to care for their families in a sustainable way. So this campaign has a policy vision of creating good quality care jobs in America, to make sure that these jobs have access to training and a career ladder, and thirdly, that we are finding and developing affordable, accessible forms of care for all families. Because right now, you either have to be very poor or you have to be very rich to get any kind of support around long-term care. My work with Caring Across Generations is very personal for me. My father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 3 years ago. My mom, sister, brother, and our spouses were all shocked, and we immediately gathered to figure out how to best support him and my mother, who's been acting as his primary caregiver through this. 1 year ago, my parents made the decision to leave their home of 40 years to move in with me, my husband, and my 5-year-old daughter, as you see on the screen. So I'm truly living as a member of what's known as the sandwich generation, or what I like to call the panini generation, as I really try to manage the needs of my parents. Everything from working with my siblings to manage their finances, their health needs, their long-term care options, and the needs of my kindergartner, all while working full-time. This journey has been tough and beautiful all at once. It has made me appreciate the real struggles families and care providers are facing, which has inspired me to build and grow Caring Across Generations as a national movement for families and care providers, driving culture and policy change to value caregiving relationships and to meet the needs of our growing care needs as a nation, right? We have to figure out how to take these stories. I mean, raise your hand in this room if you have a care story. You're responsible for caring for someone. Do you feel like you're doing it perfectly? I'm just curious. I don't know if they're doing it perfectly. Okay. But you see, there's a way in which we don't talk about those stories, right? We hold them close to our heart and we just sort of feel bad. Why can't I figure this out? Like, who knew that long-term care isn't included in Medicare? Most people think Medicare includes long-term care in America. Oh my God, there's ways in which we're suffering and struggling with this issue, and we haven't figured out how to talk about it in community and figure out what the public solutions can be to this, what can be a growing crisis in America. So the stories I've shared with you this morning should give you all this, hopefully has given you some inspiration, but also has given you a sense of the challenges, needs, and opportunities for working people. There's so many challenges to talk about, but I tried to give you at least a glimpse of what are some of the trends and patterns that we're seeing across the country. I've shared a few of the critical issues, like family workplace policies, like paid sick days and family leave, the need for elder care, child care, immigration policies, scheduling, and a real voice on the job. All of us here this morning work on so many different, yet equally important issues, and it's so promising that we're having a conversation about them today, and more broadly as a society. But let's not let our conversations begin and end today. And let's also ensure that we are getting to the heart of the matter, which is that we have to figure out, no matter how many policy innovations we have and how much good organizing we're doing, we ultimately have to figure out how we build long-term economic power and freedom in the face of an economy that's growing more and more unequal. We cannot address the changes we need without building a real movement for economic freedom in the 21st century. I really firmly believe that. There is so much excitement and so much momentum right now, with the Fight for 15 in the union, to the movement for Black lives, to the incredible dreamers and the others fighting for immigrant justice. There's so many opportunities now for innovations, for policy to be changed, and for the issues we care about so deeply to become a greater part of our public discourse. I do believe there's so much we can win today. We can build a movement that is able to put thousands, if not millions of women and men in the streets to demand their right to a better life. Because that's ultimately what this is about, our right to a better life. We can build a movement to speak to everyday people. We don't just have to change minds, but we have to build the muscle to change hearts, right? We can break out of our silos. For too long, we've been operating in issue silos and movement silos. We have to build a movement that understands the intersections and the interdependency of economic, racial, and gender justice movements. We can build our movement that is grounded in a real appreciation of the abundancy around us. We live in the United States of America, for God's sakes, right? There's enormous abundancy of intelligence and creative ideas and resources and money to make our visions for a just world possible. We can build our movement so that love and hope and solidarity are the currency that fuels the work that we do. Yes, I said the L word. Deal with it. Because I really believe that's what it's going to take. And together, I do believe we can build a 21st century economic justice movement that can imagine tomorrow and take risks today to get us there. A movement that can dream big and articulate a vision that's worth fighting for. Thank you. So much. So Rachel asked me if I would be willing to take some questions, which I am, or reactions to anything I've said. So
Juan has a mic if anybody wants to ask a question. We'll walk to you.
Hello? All right, just stand up or raise your hand and I will get to you.
No questions?
No questions. Oh, we got one.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that presentation. What would you say to those who say that Rhode Island is already too much of a sort of a welfare state, unfriendly to business, and not a place where wealthy people, job creators, businesses want to be because we do too much of this stuff already?
Should we take a few, or do you want me to go ahead and answer that? Should I? Okay. I mean, I think this becomes, I feel like that question ends up becoming a question about, well, how are we going to pay for all of this? It becomes a revenue question at the end of the day, which is important to get really crystal clear about. And I think there's lots of incredible work that's actually beginning to take shape in states and cities across the country to explore what are the different ways in which you build revenue to be able to pay for the types of supports that we know communities need and working families need today. There's also, so just to give an example, so at Jobs and Justice, we're experimenting with what's known as a low-wage employer fee. We're doing this in Connecticut, where we're saying we met in the retail sector in particular with workers and understood, we asked them, if you had extra money, if you couldn't earn more wages, what do you need the money for? And the majority of those workers said childcare. We need it for childcare, we need it for home care. And then we recognized that, like in most states, it becomes this vicious state budget battle where the providers are pitted against the families who need the services, who are pitted against, frankly, small business owners who are running child care agencies. And so we said, well, how do we get out of that cycle and that game? And what would it mean for us to actually extract resources? This goes to something the congressman said earlier of having a business model that actually is built upon taxpayers having to subsidize that business model. So building on that, in Connecticut, we attempted to introduce a low-wage employer fee, where we would have the right, the state would have the right to extract a fee, not a tax, but extract a fee from, in Connecticut's case, it was any employer with over 500 employees in the state who did not have a starting wage of $15 an hour. You extract a fee, and then workers in that sector and the home care sector, which includes small businesses, includes the providers and families, could negotiate together how that money is spent as subsidies for that workforce. So we got through the first legislative cycle. What we want is this advisory board to determine what to do once revenue comes in. Next legislative session, we hope to actually win the fee. But my point is that there's lots of really innovative things like that we can do, and there's ways in which we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of a debate that actually is a distraction from the innovations we need to be moving right now on revenue. So there's a lot of different ways in which we think about how do you tax corporations, how do you tax Wall Street, how do you tax the wealthy in a way to meet the needs, given all the charts I showed you earlier about wages being stagnant and who is benefiting. We have to shift that, we have to make changes. The only other thing I'll say is there's also incredible models of great partnerships between the private sector, businesses, with social justice groups, workers' rights groups coming up with innovations that can also help meet these needs. So even if you look in the care sector, where this comes up a lot, there's actually interesting partnerships between Care.com, which is a big online platform, with the National Domestic Workers Alliance to begin to raise standards and figure out alternate revenue strategies as well. So there's lots of ways and opportunities to build those kinds of partnerships, I think, in this moment. If that helps. Thank you.
Sarita, thank you for your comments today. One of the things I really appreciated in what you were talking about was sort of the intersection of issues. Too often we keep things separated from each other. This is an immigrant rights issue, this is an economic justice issue, and really it's often both, or multiple quote-unquote issues coming together. Around that particular one, I'm curious if you have any advice to us as Rhode Islanders as what we could do at the state level around protecting the economic rights and workers' rights of immigrants, given that it's usually thought of as a federal policy issue.
Yeah.
But there's got to be something we can do here at the state level.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and there's incredible leaders here in this room from the immigrant justice movement who can certainly speak, and I think will be speaking on a panel in a little bit about some of those solutions. But I will say, you're absolutely right. We cannot wait for a comprehensive immigration reform package to happen. Many of us have been waiting for a long time for that to happen and have really mobilized heavily for that to happen, and we still want to push for that. But we also need to build in protections at the state and local level. So one example I talked a little bit about, when I talked about Vicente and Pedro, I talked about the POWER Act. One of the things that we're starting to do is look at the state level about how do you build in protections around retaliation of immigrant workers and frankly all workers who stand up in their workplace and demand change. There's the incredible growth of retaliation that's been happening. People being fired for speaking up for their rights, to just miseducation about what their rights are. And so the POWER Act is an example at a local level where you can win. What we did in the state of, actually in DC area and in the state of Florida, we passed what was called an ICE neutrality agreement, where we basically said there's a federal agreement between the Department of Labor and Department of Homeland Security that when there's a workplace campaign or issue, and if it's immigrant workers, the Department of Homeland Security should stay out of it and be neutral and let the workplace campaign take root. And so we then figured out locally we could run ICE neutrality campaigns to make sure that the local agencies are in fact following that federal memorandum. And we were able to win incredible victories for immigrant workers in the state of Florida as a result of that, and in DC. So there are things like that that can be done. In addition to, I know there's driver's license work happening here in the state. There's other forms of protection that's being won or pushed in Rhode Island. But I think that is a pretty key one. I think often we forget that immigrants are here working, and we have to figure out how we embrace their identity as working people and figure out how the protections that many workers may experience, how do we broaden and expand those protections for all. So I hope that's one example of how we do that, and there's probably multiple others, and on the panel today I'm sure others will lift up more campaigns. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you.